Hi folks, welcome back. You ever notice how every time Democrats shout, "threat to democracy," it's right before they do something shady? Whether it's ballot harvesting, lawfare, or slicing up congressional maps like deli meat, the party of norms has turned into the party of power grabs. Case in point, Governor Gavin Newsom, California's blow-dried overlord, glitching in real time when asked how much his redistricting stunt here in our state is going to cost taxpayers. Spoiler alert, he doesn't tell us because, let's be honest, he knows. He's just hoping you're too dazzled by his, hair to notice. These people aren't even defending a democracy anymore. They're defacing it with a Sharpie and a smug grin. And speaking of smug, Gavin recently held this press conference to brag about his fire prevention efforts as if Californians somehow forgot that entire neighborhoods were incinerated earlier this year. But sure, pat yourself on the back. Anyway, let's roll the tape and watch the math slip.
Now over 50 projects have been complete. Over 12,000 critical acres have been treated. This builds on our historic amount of acreage treated in this state, supported by 10x the amount of investments that we have seen in prior administrations. That's just a reflection
10x
of our commitment to not just prepare for wildfire season and suppression mindset, but also prevent wildfires as well.
Isn't it interesting how all it took was for tens of thousands of families to lose their homes in massive fires across California for Gavin to suddenly realize wildfire prevention might actually be important? By the way, folks, this isn't leadership. It's just damage control dressed up as foresight. For years, Gavin ignored crumbling forest management while pouring billions into green virtue signaling and bullet trains to absolutely nowhere. Now, with public trust burning as fast as our hillsides, Gavin wants a pat on the back for treating 12,000 acres after decades of policy that left quite literally millions vulnerable. So the real story here isn't just bureaucratic failure, it's ideological rot. Democrat governance in California has for long prioritized optics over outcomes. So much so that they've let the environmental lobby neuter the state's ability to do controlled burns, buried land management in red tape, and sold the public on the fantasy that climate change alone was to blame for all of our problems. But wildfires aren't just acts of nature. They're also consequences of negligence. Newsom's sudden focus on prevention isn't a strategy. It's a scramble to rewrite the narrative before voters connect the dots and his presidential ambitions circle the drain like the ashes of another avoidable disaster.
There's simply no jurisdiction in the world that has more assets at bear, more aerial assets than the state of California. We've made bold commitments over the course of the last many years, and we're delivering on those commitments. And that's the purpose of today, getting these final two Firehawks, 16 total, now into our possession, fulfilling the commitment that was imagined about 2 decades ago.
And for anybody counting, 2 decades is how long Gavin Newsom has been in power here in California. Isn't it interesting how it took him 20 years to fulfill a basic promise like upgrading our firefighting fleet? Now he's parading helicopters like trophies as if delayed competence is a substitute for leadership. This isn't about public policy, by the way. It's about political theater. The truth is, California has long had the resources to do all of this and more. What it's lacked is the political will to prioritize actually serving the people and protecting them over pet projects that these politicians love to go on ideological crusades over. Billions were dumped into high-speed rail fantasies to nowhere and bloated bureaucracies while the state's wildfire crisis grew worse year to year. And it's still growing worse. Democrats built a narrative where climate change was the sole villain of every single one of our problems in this state so they could essentially excuse themselves of any fault or wrongdoing while ignoring decades of mismanagement, blocking forest thinning, and handcuffing land agencies that made California a literal tinderbox. Newsom's victory lap now is less about accomplishment and more about rewriting history so he can make himself look good when he goes to run for president. And it's never been more transparent that a politician is hoping voters forget who helped fan the flames of all of these awful things happening in California in the first place. This is the cost of Democrat governance, folks. Keep this in mind, okay? It's always optics over outcome and delay disguised as progress.
I think there's a growing recognition in this country, not just with Democrats, independents, but also Republicans, that de facto the Trump presidency ends in November of next year if the American people are given a fair chance and a voice and a choice. We will take back Congress. President of the United States.
Or you're going to steal it.
Recognizes that, so he wants to rig the game, wants to change the rules midterm. They're very effective at this. They've done this in the past. They've got a lot of experience.
Like you.
He dials up Greg Abbott, says, I need 5 instead of 12,000 votes. Georgia, I need 5 House seats. He obliges, and they're doing a midterm rejection of objectivity and independence, a act that we could criticize from the sideline or an act that we can respond to in kind, fight fire with fire in the spirit that brings us here together today.
Fight fire with fire, Governor? Folks, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that Gavin couldn't have picked a worse time to use that pun. The man who's presided over California as it literally and metaphorically burned to the ground while families lost homes, lives, and livelihoods now says he wants to fight fire with fire to save democracy. I guess, pun intended. But beyond the cringe wordplay, this is the blueprint of modern Democrat rhetoric, folks. Project, accuse, and justify breaking norms as a moral duty. Gavin frames any Republican advantage as rigging while openly pushing for mid-cycle redistricting schemes and lawfare campaigns designed to tip the scales in his favor and his party's favor. It's a classic bad faith strategy. Claim democracy is under attack when we don't even live in a democracy. It's a constitutional republic. Then use the fear that comes along with that to dismantle the very systems that uphold our constitutional republic. All of that to say that we're not even witnessing a defense of democracy coming from Gavin. It's a rationalization for power grabs wrapped in sanctimony. And the media, of course, will run this with zero challenges. This moment isn't about Newsom's hypocrisy, by the way. It's about how the Democrat Party now defines democracy as whatever keeps them in charge, and will torch every rule book on the way to preserve that illusion. By the way, this is straight out of the Venezuelan authoritarian playbook. Textbook Chavismo, which is better hair. When Gavin talks about defending democracy by rewriting the rules, demonizing opponents, and justifying institutional warfare, he's not actually preserving the republic. There's no attempt there. He's just performing a polished, California-friendly version of what Hugo Chavez did with a red sash and a bullhorn, while looking kind of like the Hunchback of Notre Dame. It's the exact same script, folks. Claim moral urgency, accuse your enemies of rigging the system, then consolidate power under the guise of saving it. The only difference is Gavin doesn't have to ring a bell to do it.
Well, I mean, there's no the MasterCard commercial, priceless democracy, values, rule of law. But the question's the right question. It's a good question, and we're just in the process of analyzing that. But
dude's just saying buzzwords.
For your consideration, there are many local elections that first Tuesday already on the ballot, so it requires significantly less resources than a special election that didn't already have regular elections considered. So that's now being scoped out with that nuanced consideration. So that could be very meaningful in mitigating the cost. But I honestly, on this one, there's too much at stake. And
did Gavin just have an aneurysm because someone asked about the price tag of one of his plans? This is what happens, folks, when accountability collides with political theater. Gavin, usually slick and rehearsed, completely short circuits when forced to justify the cost of his backroom redistricting scheme. And that matters because underneath the stammering is a tell. When the rhetoric about protecting democracy starts falling apart under basic scrutiny, it reveals the hollowness of the entire operation that's at play before our very eyes. This isn't even about civic virtue anymore, folks. It's about consolidating power under the illusion of fairness. The Democrat Party has truly mastered the art of moral framing to mask raw political maneuvering using words like equity and justice, or in this case, democracy, as rhetorical shields against real questions. It's the Marxist playbook up and down, folks. So Newsom's incoherence isn't just a reflection of poor preparation. It's a symptom of a deeper rot where ideology replaces logic and emotional buzzwords are deployed to shut down debate. The fact that so many institutions still let this pass without challenge shows how far we've drifted from a culture of scrutiny to one of narrative obedience to Democrats, especially in this state where Newsom basically has the backing of the entire media establishment. They want to see this guy win. They want to see this guy in the White House because they know that once he's in there, it's going to be an endless funnel of federal dollars coming into California. And if you've been living in California, or at least following our politics for the last decade, you know that half of that money, those trillions of dollars, are just going to straight up evaporate the moment that they hit the bank accounts of all the NGOs that make a living off of grifting, off of the hurt that is constantly inflicted upon taxpayers in the state. So the question isn't just what these politicians are doing, it's why so many people still believe them. Why does anybody take a Democrat at their word? Why are we so quick to accept polished slogans over plain truth? Why do words like democracy and equity silence scrutiny instead of inviting more of it, especially when you consider that we don't live in a democracy? The founding fathers hated democracy. That's why they made this a constitutional republic. All that being said, asking basic questions like how much something is going to cost from our governor who is doing the spending cannot become taboo, because what we're witnessing at this point from Newsom goes far beyond political spin. It's the normalization of manipulation where confusion is the point and clarity is a threat. If power can be maintained by emotion, repetition, and distraction, do facts even matter? That's the world that Democrats are currently building, folks. One where language is weaponized, transparency is completely performative, and your role is to just nod and go along. But maybe it's time that we stop nodding. Maybe it's time to start asking what all of this performance is really hiding, especially as we're gearing up for the midterms and then another general election after that. Because you know that once the Democrat machine gets behind a candidate, they move in lockstep. We got to witness that happen in real time with arguably the worst presidential candidate in the history of this country. Democrats 1 week were bashing Kamala Harris as incompetent. And then after she got the nomination, she was being hailed like the new FDR, like a genius. We have to be cognizant of that, folks, because they go for emotion. That's what they go for. They want to blind you of your logic, and that's how they do it, through emotional coercion. Don't let them get away with it. And you tell me what you think in the comments down below. Hope you have a terrific day. Peace.